go ahead and get the meeting started. I know we're going to have some late joiners, but that always happens, which is why we have some announcements at the beginning. But I'm Connie Nestor, and I've had the pleasure of chairing the Scottish American History Forum for about 12 years. I serve as a governor on the Board of Governors of Illinois' equivalent to St. Andrew's Society, our Chicago Scots community. And I just want to wish everyone a very hearty welcome this morning. As we've been discussing, some of us are down here at the North Carolina Grandfather Mountain Scottish Festival and Highland Games. And so I'm actually broadcasting from my hotel room this morning in Blowing Rock. But as most of you know, the Scottish American History Forum is part of the Arts and Cultural Division of Chicago Scots. And Chicago Scots, again, was formerly the Illinois St. Andrew Society, which founded the oldest 501c3 charity in the state of Illinois. And this was way back in 1845. So we're very old society. We later named the campus Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care. It's located in North Riverside, Illinois, and we offer skilled nursing services, memory care, long-term care, assisted living, and independent living on the campus. So again, we'd love to have you come up and visit sometime. Chicago Scots is dedicated to nurturing Scottish identity through service, fellowship, and celebration of Scottish culture, in addition to supporting Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care. And so I would like to urge you all, if you'd like to get some additional information, you just go to our website, www.chicagoscots.org, where you had to register for the event today. And we ask that everyone please try to give generously to this charity. It's a one-of-a-kind mission for Scottish old people that all Scots can be proud of. We think we're one of a kind on the globe. Now, before we begin our presentation today with our esteemed guest, John Mann, I just would like to remind everyone that next month we're going to have Christopher Thompson, who is counselor and head of Scottish government in the United States. He's officed at the British Embassy in Washington, D.C., and he's going to be with us to discuss the story of Scottish democracy, where we are now and where we're headed. So I think that will be very, very interesting. Also, before we move forward with the presentation, I just want to let you know that Gus Noble, our president here in the Chicago area, in the Illinois St. Andrew Society area, will not be with us today because he is in Scotland receiving his actual OBE award. And he was at the Palace, and I think it was a couple of days ago to receive the award, and also was invited to take part in the St. Giles, I think it was the ceremony or the opening for their new interactive venue on genealogy, St. Giles Cathedral, and King Charles was actually there. So Gus is in the middle of some recognition in Scotland, and we're all very proud of him. And I'm sure if you have a chance, extend your hearty congratulations to Gus. Okay, so on that happy note, I believe it is time to move forward. I am so very pleased to have with us live from the state of Maine, broadcasting from Jimmy Pond, and you'll have to tell us a little bit about that, John. But we have John Mann, who was the founding father and chairman emeritus of the Maine Ulster Scots Project. And John, we just haven't heard nearly enough about Ulster Scots. And I, for one, plan to take laborious notes today while you're speaking. So we're absolutely delighted to have you here. Thanks for making the time. And Jack and I are ready to turn it over to you now. So thank you. We'll have question and answer afterwards, folks. So get your questions and discussion points ready. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us at the Scottish American History Forum today. Big thanks to the forum and to the Chicago Scots organization, and particularly to Connie Nestor and Julie Potter Dunlop, who cajoled me into doing this and set everything up for me, made it easy, along with Jack's help on the IT. IT is not my strong suit, but I will get into what I think is my strong suit shortly. So thank you all for coming. It's very nice to see so many Maine faces come and join with this organization, and maybe we can become a stronger unit by cooperating with each other in the future. I sure hope we will. The Maine Ulster Scots project was an idea that came to me in a flash of light in 2005, and I will get into that more a little bit as we go along. But basically, just to set the stage, I was at a cemetery interment for my uncle in 2005 in the month of May, winter being too rugged up here for most people to be able to be buried. So we wait till May, and we plan our friends and relatives that pass on. And I was standing there looking around the cemetery after Uncle Bill had been laid away, and somebody came up to me and said, you know, next year's the 250th anniversary of the Means massacre, and something ought to be done about it. And the light glistening off the headstones kind of entered my head, and I had a moment of clear thought. And it occurred to me that we have a problem, because so few people today are aware of the Ulster Scots history in Maine. It's never been incorporated into our school system, and it's just been a matter of oral tradition down through the centuries, and that oral tradition is starting to wane with the change in the population structure of the state of Maine. So I came up with an idea, and I took it to the St. Andrew Society of Maine and presented them with the idea that the 250th anniversary of the massacre was coming up, and we needed to do something to preserve the history of the Scots in Maine in writing, because oral tradition was not going to help us in the long run. So the St. Andrew Society of Maine took on that task, and they floated enough money for me to publish a small book called The Ulster Scots on the Coast of Maine, which was intended to be a report. I did not consider myself a writer, but I do have to do technical reports on a regular basis. And I thought if I could get it in writing, then people could understand it, and then the reenactment of the massacre that would take place on the 250th anniversary would make some sense to people. So it got put in writing as a starting point for the Maine Ulster Scots project, whose mission was to save and share the stories of Maine Ulster Scots people. As I said, well, we'll get into the details as we go along. State of Maine I put up here for anybody from away that's not familiar with the boundaries of Maine. Most of you certainly are, but the state of Maine sits at the northeast corner of the country and projects up into Canada, into what used to be Nova Scotia, and it looks as it does here on this map today. But when Maine started out as a province or a district, it looked much different. And it was, in fact, the eastern frontier of the English occupation of America in the colonial period. If you look at this map from 1755, which is a detail of a map done by Mitchell, it's called Mitchell's Map of North America, and was provided to us by David Mitchell at a 2018 conference. Thank you, David. This shows the province of Maine on the left as being just a narrow strip of land between the Piscataqua and the Kennebec rivers. Of course, now the current map goes all the way over to the right and much further to the north. So how did that change? How did that eastern frontier progress from west to east, and why did it progress? And therein lies the story of the Ulster Scots in Maine, which we'll try to flesh out. Dave McCausland has put this chart together for us, and it shows you that Maine, according to the U.S. Census Bureau of 2020, has the highest percentage of Scots and Scots-Irish combined total for the states in the country, and that is percentage of population, people who recognize themselves as being of Scots or Scots-Irish descent. Interesting statistic, and not one that I think most Scots in America would come to automatically in thinking about their history of the Scots in America. But there it is, Maine leads the way. But after we get done with this report, I suspect you'll wonder why that number isn't much higher. If you look at the settlements that were created along the coast of Maine prior to the American Revolutionary War, there were over 30 settlements, communities of Scots and Scots-Irish that occupied that coastline. That was the majority culture at that time, probably stayed the majority culture up into the 1760s and 1770s, after the Indian Wars were over and the land became safe to live on and the influx of new immigrants started to come in. But before the land was safe to live on and the Indian Wars were raging on, the Scots and Ulster Scots arrived and settled beginning in the west corner of the state and moving eastward up the coast over time. Anybody doing serious research on the state of Maine and trying to figure out where their people came from is going to have a lot of trouble, because the boundaries of the districts and the names of the areas have changed repeatedly over time, and you need to have a chart to show you what the name is now versus what the name was then, and where the boundaries are now versus where the boundaries were then. And it's a long, tedious process, and hopefully the work that we're doing at the Maine Ulster Scots Project is going to make that much easier for people in the future. This is just a small sample of the name changes that have taken place in the immediate area in Western Maine. A lot of Indian names, and I'm going to use the term Indian and I'm going to use the term Native American interchangeably. I don't mean any disrespect to anyone, but I find there are some people that don't like the term Indian and there are some people that don't like the term Native American. And I will simply use them both, because I think they were used historically, and no reason to apologize too much for that. As you get into the history and the boundary changes, you're probably going to need, if you're a serious researcher, a copy of this book, which incorporates the dissolutions and boundary changes of the state of Maine from the beginning of time to current. And you'll find numerous names for the same locations, and boundaries shifting and county lines shifting, and even the borders of the state itself shifting. Title to these lands has been a problem and an ongoing dispute since the beginning of occupation. My life as a professional has been to chase those boundary lines down and determine who owns what in the current arrangement here in the state of Maine. And in order to do that, I have had to go back to the point of beginning on where each boundary was created in order to determine, the chain of events that took place that changed the boundaries between the point of beginning and where we are now, in order to determine a professional opinion of people's property boundaries. So that's my background, and that's how I get into it. But I'm going to start on the western corner of the state of Maine and work our way east with the Scots and Scots-Irish settlers. And again, I'm using those terms interchangeably. Ulster Scots, Scots-Irish, again, interchangeable in my mind. The Battle of Dunbar in 1650 and the Battle of Worcester were a tragic event for the people of Scotland. A pair of events. In the Civil War with Cromwell, they took a terrific beating, and there were many casualties, and there were certainly many prisoners taken. The Scottish Diaspora Tapestry project that was set for 2014 in the 700th anniversary of the Battle of Bannockburn looked at the Scottish diaspora around the world and invited people to make tapestry panels showing that diaspora. And Maine was privileged to provide 4 panels because of all of our different Scottish immigration to Maine. So within that project for the tapestry, they describe the impact of the battles of Dunbar and Worcester as follows. Of the 10,000 prisoners taken at Worcester and others from the previous battle at Dunbar, many were marched naked like cattle to London. Some were executed for public display, and others were transported as forced laborers to New England or Barbados. Of those that came to New England, some were sold to work in the ironworks at Saugus, Massachusetts, and others to the sawmills of Berwick in the district of Maine. I guess that's pronounced Berwick over there and Berwick over here, just to be confusing. So many Scots came to the Berwick area that it was referred to as Scotland. As these indentured Scots earned their eventual freedom, they became a part of the root stock of Maine's early frontier families that moved further down east and settled several Maine islands and townships. So there's your point of beginning, if you will, for the settlement of Maine with Scots. And as we move along, this is the actual panel that went into the tapestry quilt for representing those people, along with some of the names of the Scottish prisoners. And if you chase Maine's old families back far enough, many of these families in Maine today have roots with these prisoners that came over in that time period. This is a picture of the McIntyre garrison in South Berwick. It was built in approximately 1706 or 7 by a son of one of the Scottish prisoners, and may very well be the oldest structure still standing in the state of Maine. If you look in the corner board on the lower part of the building, you'll see a little covered door. And if you're there at the site and you open that covered door, you can see the original log construction of that building from 1707. Pretty darned amazing to see that still standing and in such good shape. The dovetail corners of that log construction are typical of the time period. The overlapping Lincoln log corners came later with the Scandinavians, I'm given to understand. But the Scots and Scots-Irish were using the dovetail corners, which are so remarkably strong and durable, obviously, from this picture. If you want to get into more details with the Scottish prisoners, I encourage you to look at Carol Gardner's work. She provided a chapter in our book, Reflections, 1718-2018, 300 Years of the Scots, Irish, and Maine. That was the result of our 2018 symposium at Bowdoin College. I will be referring to this book many times as we go forward, but Carol Gardner, Diane Rappaport, and Tad Baker have all done work with this group, and all have written articles, and Carol's got the most recent work in her books. So check it out if you're interested in that group of people at all. It's a fascinating story. So as we go back to the map detail from the Mitchell map of 1755, you would picture the Scottish prisoners here in the southwest corner. And then moving eastward up towards Casco Bay, you start to run into the Ulster Scots settlement. But that map is what I would call an English or New England perspective of the ownership of the provinces in the District of Maine or province of Maine. And it shows New England to the left and the province of Sagadahoc to the right, which is part of the greater Nova Scotia area, and just leaves this strip of land as being Maine at that time period. But what is the perspective of the Native Americans? That, of course, is going to be very different. And it doesn't mean one is wrong and one is right. It just means they have different perspectives. This map that we found from 1713, done by a French cartographer, shows the territory of the Abenaki, the Native Americans of the region. And it again shows Nova Scotia and Cape Breton to the right, and New England to the left, and New France to the north. But all of the coastline from the Kennebec River to the east is listed as land of the Abenaki. Where's the boundary between the two? Well, it might be a little iffy. Where's the boundary between the Abenaki and New France? Well, that might be pretty iffy. The whole thing's pretty iffy, if you ask me. And so therein lies the problem. Here's another map of New France, which I'm going to zoom in. Hopefully you can see the pink area being New England, the yellow area being Nova Scotia. The orange area being land of the Native Americans, and then New France and Quebec beyond that. And where do they all converge? Where's the hot point? Where is the borderland? Ulster Scots have a reputation of being of the borders and following the borders across America as it developed. Well, here we have a case in point. We have this confluence of cultures coming together at the Kennebec River Valley. And that, of course, is where the Ulster Scots were given the opportunity to settle. But what led up to that settlement? Well, if you go back to King William's War, which fell between the time period of the Scots prisoners' arrival and the Ulster Scots' arrival, at the time period being late 1600s, Fort Loyal, which had been built at what is now Portland it was then Falmouth, had been attacked and destroyed, and 200 to 300 people probably massacred at that fort, leaving it empty and undefended. The Candlemas massacre at York, also in the 1690s, similar situation, similar result. Many people were killed, many were taken captive, many did not survive the trip to Canada in captivity during the wintertime conditions. This memorial stone lists the situation where the settlement was attacked, burning the houses and killing or capturing 300 of its inhabitants. About 40 were killed and the rest marched to Canada, many dying on the way. So you see a pattern in the 1690s of the District of Maine collapsing under its English occupation. The Fort William Henry fort at Pemaquid at the end of Kennebec River in Bristol was destroyed for the second time in 1696. So from the Kennebec River to the Piscataqua, the area was pretty near completely left without occupation and without defenses. The people that did survive collapsed back into Massachusetts and set up a general panic, which I won't go into, but if you think Salem witch trials, you're heading in the right direction. And Massachusetts, of course, was the next in line to fall if things continued in the same way that they were progressing in Maine. And it set up a serious situation that Cotton Mather thought he could address by the following system that he recorded in his records of 1706. Cotton Mather, of course, being the head of the Congregational Church in the Boston area at the time. He said, "I write letters unto diverse persons of honor, both in Scotland and in England, to procure settlements of good Scotch colonies to the northward of us. This may be a thing of great consequence. It was Mather's plan to settle hardy families on the frontiers in Maine and New Hampshire to protect the towns and churches of Massachusetts from the French and Indians. In his memorial of the present deplorable state of New England, he suggests that a Scotch colony might be of good service in getting possession of Nova Scotia." So therein lies the grand scheme. And he writes letters and people start to come. Now, Mather was connected with and knew many of the ministers, either by reputation or in person. And his letters hit the Ulster area at an interesting time when things were not going as well for the inhabitants as they had been in the past. And it began an influx of immigration from Ulster to America. Ulster, of course, being located in the north of Ireland and had been populated with people moving from Scotland and northern England and the French Huguenots into Ulster during the 17th century. And if you want to get into the details of the lives of the people and what was going on there during that century, I encourage you to read William Ralston's contribution to our book, Reflections, which is available obviously at our website. So as I started to say earlier in the talk, these people had a lot of different names applied to them. Seldom were they called Scots, but they were often called Irish, and sometimes Scotch-Irish. More recently, they're being called Scots-Irish. The term crackers is applied, rednecks, hillbillies, even God's frontiersmen, people with no name. 30 million Americans roughly credit their line of heritage to the Ulster Scots that came to Maine, not to Maine, but to America. So as we go back and look at that confluence of cultures and political interests, here again, we have the Native Americans owning down the Kennebec River, New England pushing up into the Piscataqua and onto the Kennebec, and France claiming title all the way to the Kennebec from the east in Nova Scotia. So lands were offered by many different venues to the Ulster Scots, and this was where they came and were placed on purpose by Cotton Mather's grand plan. So starting in 1718, there were two ships that arrived in Falmouth Harbor, or in Casco Bay, I should say. One was the Robert and one was the McCallum. And on the Robert, led by Reverend McGregor, were a number of parishioners and others who would come from the north of Ireland. And on the McCallum that came into the Brunswick area was another group of people, both in 1718, and the Robert was frozen into the ice in the bay by the end of November, I understand, which made for some pretty difficult months ahead to get through the Maine winter, as you can imagine. But nobody was lost, according to the records that we have. We have no evidence that anybody died during that period, so they must have been a hardy bunch. My people were on that ship, the Means family, and we'll hear more about them as we go along. The state of Maine is developed and settled by literally hundreds of different property owners called proprietors, great proprietors and small proprietors. Some of them owned 500,000 acres of land. Some of them owned very little as 900 acres. But they all had schemes of becoming vested with occupants of their property that would increase the property values and generate an income stream for their investments. This is a working draft of the settlement of Falmouth, which is typical of a great proprietor's working copy. These records are often not public record. They're often owned by the descendants of the proprietors. They may or may not have been found. They may or may not have been indexed in any way. I'm still finding them in my work from day to day. We have at the Maine Ulster Scots Project, through the project's work and through my work previously, created an index of over 10,000 property plans. So if you're going to do research in Maine, I would encourage you, as we get set up with our computer assisted project, to check in with us. If you've got a family in particular that you want to know about, we may be able to point you in the direction of the plan that indicates where they lived and what their property was. This 1720 plan is of the Brunswick area. And if you zoom in on it, it's a plan by a man named Southwark, known as Southwark's map. And he shows the Brunswick area as being a new Irish settlement. These would be the people from the McCallum and the people that came shortly after under Robert Temple's scheme, which settled the area along the Kennebec River. European occupation of Maine's eastern frontier is a chapter in Reflections that was drafted by Mr. Leaf and Mr. Mosier. And also you can find information about Temple and Dunbar through Alistair McReynolds' Kith and Kin, a book that he had published. Merry Meeting Bay was extremely important to the Native Americans. It was a summer meeting place. It was a place of great natural resources. Fish were abounding, and 5 different rivers converge here, so Indians could come down from the inland and meet for their summer festivities. And not intended, They had not intended for the Europeans to settle there. They thought they had an agreement that they would not settle above the chops, but nonetheless, the Ulster Scots were invited to settle there and expand the claim of Massachusetts proprietors and others on the area. The unrest that resulted from that resulted in Massachusetts General Court sending a group of dignitaries to meet with the Indians and decide what it was that they were complaining about and what could be done about it. And the list of those grievances in detail can be found in the Mass Archives, volume 29, page 59 through 63. But I'll just summarize quickly the more important ones. One was the fact that the trading houses were taking advantage of the Native Americans by giving them access to rum before they did the trades. And the Native Americans felt that there were violations of old treaties, that they did not have the right to come above the chops on the Kennebec River. And if they did think they had the rights, that they had gotten those rights from the wrong group of Indians. They said it was the Androscoggin Indians they had gotten a treaty with, and not the Kennebec Indians. So it was a big mess. It led to Dummer's War. William Dummer was the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, who conducted the details of the war. And in the process, the Native Americans came down and wiped out, in the summer of 1722, virtually all of the homes and all of the farm animals within the region from Brunswick to Swan Island on the Kennebec. The colony of Cork, so-called, and the colony of Somerset on the other side of the river were completely wiped out. Having said that, in between the wars between France and England, there were periods of cooperation and friendship between the Scots-Irish and the Native Americans, as depicted in this scene, and as depicted on one of the tapestry panels for the tapestry project. During the years from 1718 to 1760, over 30 communities along the coast of Maine were settled with Ulster Scots, relocated to America's eastern frontier. Although the history of relations between Europeans and First Nations people sometimes resulted in tragedy through misunderstanding and exploitation, there is good documentation of cooperative beneficial actions between the two groups, especially early on. We don't want to lose track of that. And this panel from the tapestry shows that spirit of cooperation with the trade of goods. The potatoes from the Scots-Irish side, and the corn, beans, and squash from the Indian side. And it's a bit of a celebration of that period between wars. What was the living condition like? We have this quote from Reverend Jacob Bailey, who served at Pownalborough on the Kennebec River, just north of what was Cork. The people were thinly settled along the banks of rivers in a country which afforded a rugged and disagreeable prospect. They were in general so poor, not to say idle, that their families almost suffered for necessary food and clothing, and they lived in miserable huts, which scarce afforded them shelter from the inclemency of the weather and a rigorous climate. And their lodgings were rather worse than food, clothing, or habitations. I might here add many affecting instances of their extreme poverty, that multitudes of children are obliged to go barefoot through the whole winter, with hardly clothes to cover their nakedness, that half the houses were without chimneys, that many people had no other beds than a heap of straw, and the whole families had scarce anything to subsist upon for months together, except potatoes roasted in the ashes. Well, that's a pretty grim description. There are other descriptions that aren't quite so grim, but there is without a doubt a lot of truth to what he said. He was an eyewitness to the situation. And after 1722, in the shakeup of the initial start from these people getting settled in Maine, there were undoubtedly some hard times. Moving easterly from the Kennebec River into the further east down the coast of Maine, down east as we say, the next great proprietor to come along was David Dunbar. a former soldier who was appointed as Surveyor General of the King's Woods in America. He had a scheme to take the area known as the Sagadahoc and have title vested in his name by the crown, English crown, and bring in a great many hundred of those lately come from Ireland to be his tenants. It didn't work out. Dunbar did bring in a lot of people, but he was a highly unliked person, and Massachusetts was livid to think that he had grabbed title away from that section of the Maine coast, and also petitioned the crown and had the crown reverse their position and grant title to Massachusetts and take it away from Dunbar. This created a huge problem for the Ulster Scots because their title had come from Dunbar, whose title was now defunct, and they had no title from the proprietors of Massachusetts. So as the proprietors of Massachusetts came up and tried to reclaim the land that Dunbar had granted to the Scots-Irish, as you can imagine, there was resistance. And there was a lot of resistance. And barns got burned and surveyors' ears got cut off, and there were people tarred and feathered. And there was a long period of backwoods resistance that took place. And Alan Taylor's book, Liberty Men and Great Proprietors, is probably the most documented depiction of that time period. And I would encourage you to, if you get the chance, to read that book. Colin Woodard's The Lobster Coast also covers it. It is not covered in a typical Maine history book. It is not covered in any Massachusetts history books that I'm aware of. And it's part of our lost history that we're trying to reclaim. Moving further along in that same general area, Samuel Waldo claimed a patent of 576,000 acres in 1729 and recruited German settlers to the mid-coast. Waldo died unexpectedly while he was inspecting his property in 1759, and after a period of time, Henry Knox, the artillery general from the Revolutionary War, who had married Waldo's granddaughter, gained the controlling interest in the Waldo patent. And he tried to create a land-based empire by settling Ulster Scots in his district. But he preferred the tenant system and not the land ownership system, hoping to make himself a European-style landlord. The Ulster Scots did not. They did not agree with his approach. Did not like the man at all. And interestingly enough, Henry died from swallowing a chicken bone. And the Ulster Scots continued to occupy the land. Up in that area, there are a lot of good survey maps that show who settled where, and even give you the deed references that are recorded where they got the property. So you can look in and you'll see people like Copeland and Copp and Malcolm and Maloney and all kinds of Irish connected names, Ireland connected names in those regions. Again, having an index to the survey plans for the state of Maine is a huge step up for anybody that's starting this research. So through exile, purchase, settlement, conflict, resistance, sweat equity, and harassment, the Scots and the Ulster Scots established the coastal boundaries of Maine by providing the human occupation required to create defendable title to the new homeland. Sometimes it took as much as 100 years to do that, but they did it. But what about the rest of the state of Maine? If you want to see the details of some of that occupation and land ownership, you can look at my chapter in Reflections on Relationships with the Land. If you look at the modern day map of Maine, of course, there's much more to the north that is not on the shoreline. So what's the history with that? Well, there we go. We get the fourth panel from the tapestry that talks about northern Maine, and which we affectionately call the Crown of Maine or Aroostook County. And you see the potato farms up there, and you see this quote from Robbie Burns about the soul of freedom. So from 1839 to 1903, we have an influx. Maine's Aroostook and Washington counties have historic and cultural ties to Canada. The area was formerly a part of New Scotland, which is now known as Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Many of Maine's northern inhabitants can trace their ancestry through Canada and back to the Highland clearances of Scotland and to Ulster Plantation in the north of Ireland. This region has become affectionately known as the Crown of Maine. Settlement of northern Maine was particularly strong from 1839 to 1903 following the so-called Aroostook War, which settled the boundary between the USA and Canada. So the reputation of the Ulster Scots being border people was used and used effectively to extend the eastern border of America all the way up to where the Maine's boundaries are today and into Nova Scotia and up into Quebec and New Brunswick. Maine's boundaries are established, the eastern frontier is tamed, Massachusetts and New England are saved. Cotton Mather's thing of great significance is achieved through Scottish relocation to America's frontier. So where's the history? Where's the recognition of Scots in Maine? And where's their story to be found? It is not found in writing until now. As I said in the beginning, it's an oral history that's handed down by family members, and it didn't make it into the Massachusetts history books, and it didn't really make it into Maine's history books either. I like to tell the story of my daughter Kelly coming home from a college history class, Maine history class, with a very thick volume of Maine history. And I said to myself, here we go. Now we'll find out some facts about our people. And I looked up Ulster Scots, Scots Irish in the index, and sure enough, there was a page number, and I went to the page and there was one paragraph on the history of the Scots in Maine in a Maine history book. Now I know Maine's got a lot of history and there's a lot of things to talk about, but one would think we deserved at least a chapter. George Mitchell, Senator George Mitchell, of course, helped bring peace to Northern Ireland. And he wrote in the preface for the book, They Changed Their Sky, that my work for the peace process and recognition in Northern Ireland has taught me that historical amnesia never succeeds in the long term, and therefore it is imperative to chronicle the experience of this group, speaking of the Ulster Scots and Maine. I agree with him, and that's the work that we've taken on for ourselves, the Maine Ulster Scots Project. This gentleman in the picture happens to be my wife's grandfather, who was playing a fiddle that he made with his own hands. So where are we now? What is the Maine Ulster Scots Project doing to save this information and make it part of our history? Well, we have an information exchange program where people looking for information contact us, and we share with them what we found with the request that they share with us what they have that we haven't found. And it has built up a huge family file system that we're having scanned and so it can be researched more easily. We have a list of individuals that have come that we're working on. I think we have now over 1,000 individuals listed, who they were, where they came from, where they settled. We have a passenger ships index that is, if those of you familiar with the Ulster Scots story are probably familiar with the so-called 5 ships that came to Boston that began the immigration from Ulster to America. We have found dozens of ships that came and where they came from, and we're creating an index that will help people researching that portion of their family immigration. We've done lectures and do lectures on both sides of the pond. We've done a lot of media programs with YouTube, with film, with radio, with TV. Most of the interest in media has come from across the pond, not so much from America yet. We keep and store the Donald B. Buchanan Library, which was donated with 600 rare books of American genealogy, information, and history. We've done archaeological projects which we're still working on that document the first and second generations of Ulster Scots coming to Maine and how they transferred their lives from an Ulster and Scottish existence to an American existence, and what what changes they brought with them and what changes they had to make in order to live here successfully. We've got publications that are available: Ulster Scots on the Coast of Maine, the Reflections book that I've been talking about, and a little book that I wrote a couple of years ago called Side Shots, which talks about the impact of the transition in the second half of the 20th century for people in Maine who have been living off the resources and off the land to an economy that's controlled by the government and based on services and tourism. In progress are 3 more books, which we call the trilogy, which we hope to have published very soon. Ulster Scots on the Coast of Maine, Volume 2, Religious Folkways in the Mid-Coast Maine, written by Chip Griffin. And we're hoping to do a reprint of the original Ulster Scots on the Coast of Maine with updates. We maintain a Facebook page, which we'd like you to follow, and we do have a website. So that's where we are at the moment and what we're working on. But in the process of doing that, of course, we find the impact that the Ulster Scots have had on the state of Maine. One of those is the shipbuilding industry. Many of the families that created Maine's internationally known shipbuilding industry were Ulster Scots origin. There was a family named Black that taught a family named Schofield, that was connected to a family named Orr, that was connected to the family named Patton, all of which were building ships and created a vertical monopoly in the shipping and trading industry out of the state of Maine that peaked in the 1800s. Alistair McReynolds has addressed this in his story of the Pattons of Bath, Maine, in his book Legacy, which I encourage you to look at. Here's a notebook from my family handed down, the Anderson side of my family, which shows a sketch of a ship being built and the expenses that are going into it, created by George Rogers Anderson. And the name of the ship that he's building at that point in time is a brig called the Belfast. So we have a Belfast, Maine, and obviously a Belfast in the north of Ireland as well. Another one of the industries that was impacted was the forestry industry. These people came over, many of them thought they were going to be farmers and discovered that they had to be forest managers first. And that led to a thriving timber industry in the state of Maine. And you can follow up more of that information from the rise and fall of the McClellan family of Ballymoney in Maine through Alistair McReynolds' Kith and Kin book. Cultural influences on Maine include the fiddle tunes and ballads. That's addressed in Reflections by a chapter by Julia Lane, who's been researching that now for decades. You can follow her on her Castle Bay Entertainment website. Look for the works by Julia Lane. And and also in our book Reflections, there's a chapter on the introduction to Sam Henry's collection by Sarah Carson. Another picture of my wife's grandfather with his fiddle in the kitchen, where they would have dances in the kitchen of the farmhouse back in the day. The language has been affected, and the language, much of it brought here and was featured in the Scots-Irish poems of Robert Dinsmore. This book has been prepared that discusses Dinsmore's effect in his work here in New England by Frank Ferguson and Alistair McReynolds. And there's the dynamic duo right there. If you're watching, Alistair, thank you for all your help. Frank, you too. So the area around Cork and Somerset was wiped out, as we discussed earlier, during 1722 Dummer's War. We teamed up early on. The Maine Ulster Scots project teamed up early on with this young lady, Rebecca Graham, who was working on finding the evidence of the lost Cork colony. and as a senior project at University of Southern Maine, under the tutelage of Associate Professor Barry Rodriguez. And he discovered that we were researching the area and they were researching the area at the same time. We teamed up and we were fortunate to come be introduced to Pamela Crane, a historical archaeologist who had done a lot of work in the north of Ireland and was now looking for a project here in Maine. And she has been a brilliant asset for our group in finding and researching an original first footprint Scots-Irish home from 1718. That was the home of the McFadden family. And fascinatingly enough, the McFadden family is the same family that owns the property now as the family that originally built on it. And it went out of their ownership and came back in by Davis McFadden's grandfather, who purchased it in the 1950s. And on that property, based on research of maps and on the ground recon, we discovered the location of the original footprint for their home. And this is the first unit we put in. It took 3 years to prove it was the right site. There was 7 years of work done there. The work is ongoing. Brad McFadden is still working on it. But to give you an example of the type of findings we had, here's some pottery that was found crushed in the basement of the house. And there's the same piece of pottery put together meticulously by our volunteers and is listed as a North Devon butter jug, if that's the right term. Shows you some of the work that we've been able to do to rediscover the first footprint and the transition that took place for these Ulster Scot families coming to the wilderness of Maine in 1718. This is Dave McCausland and Harry Hopkins, what's his name? Harry, I'm sorry, I forgot his last name. Dave will tell me when we get done talking. Chasing out a burned timber in the bottom of the cellar hole. Because the Indians had burned out the building, the charred remains of the timbers were still there, buried in the dirt, even 300 years later. They disappeared quickly after they were exposed to air, but we managed to get them documented, and Dave became an expert of chasing out the timbers and following the fiber to tell which way the timbers were going and documenting that information. There's a piece of the cooking pot that they actually used to cook their meals with inside their little home on the wilderness. And there's a picture of yours truly feeling his way through a mortise and tenon joint that connected the timbers in that first footprint house. There's Pam loving what she's doing, and we're loving her doing it. And of course, the dig dogs that were there every day that we watched grow old and pass away while we were working, were devoted to our work as much as we were, I think. In the process of doing this archaeology work, we find we've become a family with the Ulster Scots connection and an interest in the work of our ancestors. And it's a good thing to see the connectivity between these families growing and reconnecting after 300 years, both on this side of the pond and on the other side. We generated a lot of media attention doing this project. You can see the sills of the building in the bottom of the hole, and more media attention. And of course, no Scottish project is complete without the bagpipes on a rainy day. Thank you, George Polkinen, for that. It was one of those moments when you hear the pipes for the first time on a place that's been burned out, a Scottish family. One of those moments when you know you're a Scot. So in the book Reflections, we have a chapter by Pamela Crane and others, and Brad McFadden himself on the McFadden family's journey to America. So that was the first generation. I'm aware of the time, and I'm going to zip through this. That was the first generation Ulster Scott family that we've documented, and we've got a great deal of information on it. So now we were interested in finding a second generation family to see how that progression of changing from Ulster Scots to American progressed over a period of time through the French and Indian Wars. The first family that we found was affected by the Tummers War. The second family that we're working with, the Means family, was affected by the French and Indian War, and their home was attacked. And we're looking for the remains of that home. And of course, it was this massacre that was the initial input for creating the Ulster Scots project in the first place. And what we're finding out is that the Means family was part of a whole settlement of Ulster Scots on this section of the coastline that's now Freeport, next to Brunswick. All of these families arrived from the north of Ireland and purchased land and built their homes here. And within that group of families was the Means family and my Mann family and my Anderson family. I'm descended from about 12 different Scottish families in this group. And we're reproducing the whole neighborhood, what was going on, who owned what, who was providing what service to whom. We're learning how they helped each other in the process of becoming successful in the eastern wilderness of America. There's Pam and her twin sister working on trying to find the exact site of the Means massacre. And here we have family members. These are 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th generation descendants of the people who were at the site back in 1756, all helping out with the process. And the process is complicated by the fact that this has been an active agricultural property for the full 300 years. And what you find in the top layer of the soil is nothing but plow scars where the plows have been through and plowed and harrowed, and all the artifacts are scattered hither and yon throughout a large area. But nonetheless, we have found ox shoes, hand-forged strap hinges, the piece of the cast iron pot that they would have prepared their meals in, and the inventory of estate for Thomas Means, which I find quite fascinating. Underlined in red are the things that we have found evidence of at the site. The land that was cleared and tilled, small house or the walls of a house, frying pan, one frying pan. We found a leg for a frying pan. Cast iron pot, we found a piece of the cast iron pot. The blue lines indicate things that are of interest in the way they lived. This was a successful family. You'll find listed among their possessions one piece of gold worth 18 pounds. You also see in their possession 2/6 interest in this sloop Judah of 77 tons. So I talked to you earlier about the interconnection of the families between the Schofields and the Pattons and the Orrs and others. And here again, we have a connection. This Means family is, it turns out Thomas Means' sister is married to one of the Pattons. Apparently he's got an investment in the ships that are being built, and the whole neighborhood is helping each other become financially successful. One other project that we took on was the cooperation with the Mann Cemetery Association to find and define this ancient cemetery that was in the neighborhood, now known as the Mann Cemetery, formerly known as the Cove Cemetery, probably one of the oldest cemeteries in the state of Maine. It was thought to have about 24 interrees, headstones. By the time we got done researching it, we had found close to 180 gravestone markers in all different formats of stone locally collected. And one of the most important things to me, which we've recently accomplished, is to connect students in Maine with students in the north of Ireland to talk about their common history and learn from each other. Many thanks to Richard Hanna for his guidance and help in getting this set up. But I wanted to show you this picture of a group of students in the north of Ireland watching live a group of students in Maine play a fiddle tune that they learned in Maine that had originally come from the north of Ireland. That, my friends, is good stuff. And I'm very pleased to see it happening. One of the things we did for those students to make it easy is prepare an illustration of what life might have been like for a first family here in Maine, and compare that to what life might have been like for a family in the north of Ireland in the same time period. So students on either side of the pond can get a feel for and talk about with each other directly how this would have affected the families at the time. The Maine Ulster Scots project meets with the Maine Highland Games people every year, and we share our stories and help people find their roots. Stories have to be told or they die. And if we don't tell them, we can't remember who we are or why we are here. That's true enough. And by connecting, I brought in some information for Connie on the Revolutionary War as well, but I'm not going to have time to talk about it right now. But I do want to get to a summary of what I've been presenting. Might go something like this. So, like a Celtic knot, our journey with Maine Ulster Scots project is doubling back on itself. Our original need to put the Means massacre into a written context for new Mainers has led us to become a group of ardent volunteers, finding and documenting physical presence of our first Ulster Scot ancestors in America at the Means family homestead, and we are becoming family again on both sides of the pond. With a certain knowledge of our past, we are made whole. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the goal of our project, and we think we're making good progress. And I would love to take your questions if this is the appropriate time to do so.
Well, John, what a moving presentation. You literally have brought a tear to my eye. And we would like to open the floor to comments and questions.
As usual, I have put 10 pounds of flour in a 5-pound sack and left 5 pounds on the floor in the process. But I hope I've given you an overview of what we do and why we do it. And I hope we've given you a feeling for the fact that the state of Maine is a Scottish colony.
This is Alan McQuiston. I just wanted to thank you. It's a wonderful presentation. Although my Ulster Scots family came through South Carolina, I was actually born in Portland, lived there 5 years, and then my first year out of college, I was the high school band director in Brunswick. So this was just super interesting to me. So thank you.
You're very welcome. Interestingly enough, the idea of bringing Ulster Scots into Pennsylvania that was presented by Secretary Logan during the colonial period was based in part on the fact of the success that had been taking place in Maine previously by bringing Ulster Scots in here and creating a buffer between the American Indians and the settlers.
So I guess another question. So my ancestors came with 5 ships that were organized by a Covenanter Presbyterian minister in 1772, coming from Antrim. And I'm curious, you mentioned the minister, I think, organizing a couple of ships. Were they Presbyterians as well then? Or?
Yes, that's correct. Presbyterian faith, of course, was under some stress at that time in the north of Ireland. It had been outlawed as a religion, actually, and people were not allowed to get married under that banner, and they weren't allowed to hold public office and so forth. So the opportunities that had been vested in them as they came from Scotland to Ulster in the beginning were disappearing. And the economic situation in the north of Ireland was becoming very difficult. So there were lots of incentives to come and actually own land rather than pay rent at exorbitant fees in the old country. And a land rich with resources and ownership rights was a very attractive thing. The violence that was here was probably not considered any worse than the violence that they had experienced for centuries previously. But the opportunities were greater.
While we're waiting for more questions or comments, John, I was planning to ask you about the Revolutionary War period, so I will follow up with you on that. I noticed your project stops at 1763, so that's disadvantageous for me, but I will definitely be in touch with you very, very quickly. I'm just wondering, what I have found repeatedly in the United States is a misunderstanding about the Ulster Scots and the Scots-Irish. And people tend to think the Scots-Irish are colonials who were either Scots or Irish. Most people don't understand that they were largely Protestant Scots who had settled in Northern Ireland for a time. And I would say many Scottish families think of themselves as just being purely Irish and aren't aware of their Scottish ancestry at all. We find that quite a bit in Chicago. We're always countering that in Chicago. How do you Mainers go about addressing that challenge?
It's the same challenge here that you've described. I can say within my own family, we had members who considered themselves Irish and members who considered themselves Scottish, and members who don't know that Scots-Irish isn't a blend. So yeah, we have the same problems. And my wife took her mother over to the north of Ireland a number of years ago when they looked up the Mabry family from Ballymoney, and they found a member of the family over there, and my mother-in-law introduced herself as a family with the same last name who were Irish. And the gentleman said, "You're not Irish at all, you're Scots." So that was her first, "Oh, how can that be? If we came from Ireland, how can we be Scots?" So, it's a problem, but I think we'll put it this way. When I started the project, when I do a lecture, I would ask the audience if they were familiar with the term Ulster Scots, and they were not, for the most part. I would ask them if they had any Scots-Irish ancestry, and half the room would raise their hand. So obviously, general understanding definitions were at play. And now, after having done all this work for the last 20 years or so, I do a lecture and I'll ask the people the same questions, and I get a very different set of answers because they're becoming educated and they're following what we're doing and they're fascinated by it, and they're finding their own connections to it. So I feel like we've done a service in that regard here in the state of Maine.
You talked about the Scots-Irish students interfacing with the Maine students as one of your projects, and I absolutely commend you for entertaining that. And I believe you said Richard Hannock.
Hannah, Hanna.
Oh, thank you. What college or university were you interfacing with over there, please?
That was a primary school that we were working with.
Oh, okay.
They were 8-year-olds, 8, 9, 10-year-olds.
Wow. Okay. Very good.
I'm not going to, because they're minors, I'm not going to give you any information on who they were.
That's okay.
But we can talk about that after. We also had a program a couple of years ago that connected virtually through the computer system from school in Northern Ireland of primary school kids with the dig site of the McFaddens. And they were, cameras were there live, and the kids were. It's fascinating because they pick up on things you wouldn't think of. and one of them was, what are all those bird noises? Because Merry Meeting Bay is full of wildlife, and the birds are chattering away all over the place, and we don't even hear it because we're used to it. But the kids in Northern Ireland say, we don't have that many birds over here. What's going on? How come you have so many birds? Another interesting comment I had from this last group was a young boy said he looked at the moose, and he looked at the bald eagle, and he looked at the trees, and he looked at the rivers, and he looked at all the things that we were presenting to them in our illustration. And his comment was, everything in America is bigger. You know, I wouldn't have thought of that, but from the mouth of babes, you know, yes, everything in America was bigger, and certainly was bigger at the time.
How, I'm wondering, are your archaeological sites open to the public, and how will we non-Maine folk manage to come up and have a tour and talk to you more about it and so forth?
They are not open to the public. The McFadden site is on private property, and they have been very generous about allowing people to come in and showing them around, and expect that will continue. But it's up to them. It's their property. It's their home. It's their land. The site we're on now is part of it, owned by an organization called the Wolf's Neck Center for Agriculture and Education, I believe is the title. And they're being very cooperative with us as well. I expect that will continue and may or may not become more public over time. But in the meantime, please contact us through our website or through Facebook, and we will be happy to entertain the idea of getting you onto these sites and letting you take a look on an individual or a small group basis. To see, I think.
Hello. Hi, I'm Kathy Smith, and I live in Freeport, so I'm very close to the wonderful work that John is doing there. And congratulations for this great talk, John, and the summary of what you're doing. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the role religion played, the Presbyterian religion as opposed to the Congregationalists, in the experience of the Scots-Irish.
Thank you, Kathy. It's good to see you. Cotton Mather wanted Protestants. He did not want Catholics to come. He wanted Protestants to come out of fear that the Catholics would join and be more connected to the French and Indian arrangement than they would be to the New England arrangement. So the Presbyterians weren't exactly what the Congregationalists were used to, but they weren't Catholic. So, and they did have a reputation for holding their ground at all cost. And so they were invited. But once they got here, of course, there was friction. And I believe there was a church that was burned down in Worcester, Massachusetts, that the Presbyterians had put up and were occupying. Certainly there was a difference of priorities in North Yarmouth, for example, which is now Freeport was part of at the time. The Presbyterians of the Flying Point area were more connected to Brunswick because of the large Presbyterian occupation of Brunswick and Thompson. And Brunswick tried to accommodate both. They knew they needed these people here, and they didn't really like the Presbyterian approach, but they knew they had to do something. So they actually set up a situation where their church in Brunswick would have a Presbyterian minister one week and a congregational minister the next. And they would break out into arguments during the sermon between the congregation and the ministers over church doctrine. But it was over time, the problem diminished relatively quickly because Presbyterian ministers were so hard to get. They had to be educated in Scotland or in a Presbyterian environment before they could become a minister to come over here. And over time, as in the South, I expect was similar. They became more of a Baptist group because the Baptists could have a layperson as the leader of their organization and a minister to their organization. So we changed over time from Presbyterianism to Baptism, I suppose, and some of them became incorporated into the Congregational Church. But in the beginning, there was some friction and there had to be deals worked out on how taxes would be applied. It was typically, you couldn't form a township in Maine without having a congregational church. And so the Presbyterians were stuck paying taxes to a church that they didn't want to attend. And it was difficult, but it did not lead to any violence that I'm aware of. But it certainly led to some political boundary changes that probably wouldn't have happened over time.
Did the Congregationalists originate in Britain and England? Or
I'm sorry, Connie, I didn't hear that.
so the Presbyterians were Scots. Who comprised the Congregationalist? Which
Well, Maine was theoretically a part of the Massachusetts political colony. So there were a lot of people settled in the area that were landowners and agents of the Puritan and Congregationalist Society of Massachusetts. But the majority of, as I said earlier, for that time period that we're interested in was Presbyterian. So you had one group that controlled the power structure and the political structure, and another group that was occupying the land and producing the goods and services necessary to make the economy work. And somehow or other, it all worked out. But the first 3 to 4 generations of Presbyterians, Ulster Scots in Maine, as in other places, I'm sure, pretty much married and intermarried amongst themselves without crossing the religious boundary. So it took probably 4 generations for that to start to sort itself out. That's why if you find an Ulster Scot like myself, who's from an old Maine family, chances are they're from all the old Scots Irish families. You get, the family tree is more like a column. You keep marrying the same families over and over again.
for those of you who can click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screens, there are a number of comments coming in from participants complimenting John and so forth that you can all read. I don't see any questions there. Jack, I don't know if you do.
One of the family stories that we have here with my family is talking about going to weddings and going in the church and having the usher say, "Are you friends of the bride or friends of the groom?" And the answer is always yes, because we're related to both.
Related to everyone in town on both sides of the family.
Yeah, right.
Hi, can I just briefly say something? There were a couple of questions, and I was one of the people, but 2 people tuned in quite late by mistake or whatever. And we were wondering if it's possible to, since this is being recorded, will there be a way to view it later?
Hi, Nancy. Yes, I put it in the chat. So this recording will be available on the Chicago Scots YouTube channel later today.
Oh, if you had it in there already, then I missed it, but thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And I did see a question from Anne quite a bit earlier. Says, do you have a resource to help research our family who was born in Pennsylvania in 1761? Joseph Cochran, and then a bunch of different spellings of Cochran there. Was there a migration from Maine to Pennsylvania? Our ancestors served in the Revolutionary War, eventually settling in Vermilion County, Illinois.
There was a migration amongst the group. There were people that came to Maine first and then moved on. Our resources don't reach out that far usually, unless we happen to stumble on it somewhere else. But the 1718 project has taken on the task of building an archive for the larger community, not just the Maine community, but the larger 1718 connected community. And I would contact somebody at 1718 project and see if they can help you out. If you know of a Maine connection or an earlier family member, we might have information on it, but chances are, if it's not that 1718, 1760 group, that's not our strong point.
John, are you familiar with the Moosehead Lake region of Maine?
Yes,
Have you ever been up there to the Sanders store?
I've never been to a store up there. I've certainly been up there poking around, but not shopping.
Oh, that happens to be where my family is from, Moosehead
Oh, really?
Lake. Yep.
Well, that's great.
Oh, we've
When you say from, when did they go into that region?
Well, I assume right around the time that you've been talking about, because my grandmother and my grandfather's mother on my father's side, the Sanders side, were part of both the Daughters of the Revolution and the Mayflower Society. So I'm not sure when they got to Maine, but I know that they were there for a while. And I know that actually my namesake, David Tilden Sanders the first, I happen to be the fifth, started a general store up there on Moosehead Lake called the Sanders Store. And I know it's still there. However, we aren't there anymore.
Yeah, that's very good.
Looks like we've got another question in here from John McLennan. How does New Brunswick relate to the Native American territory?
New Brunswick, of course, was Abenaki territory as well, and New Brunswick was part of Nova Scotia. I don't remember what year it split off, but you get so many overlapping cultures there. You get the French Acadians in that area. You've got the Ulster Scots pushing up from both from the west and from the east. You got the Highlanders coming into that area. It's very complicated cultural history, both Maine and New Brunswick. Very similar in a lot of ways. So yeah, the Wabanaki tribes extended into that region as well.
Are those tribes still present, and do you interface with them?
It's on our list of things to try to accomplish, and we've been trying to accomplish it since we began. We're finding it very difficult to build a really active relationship with them, which is understandable given the history of the two groups. But I think it's vitally important that we do continue to work at that and gain the respect for each culture that they deserve, and work together to bring these complicated stories to life for everybody to learn from.
Folks, we've got a few minutes left. We've got about 7 minutes left. So don't be shy. If you have something to say, please by all means do.
While we're waiting, I'll go through where we are right now and what we're looking at for the future. We have some ideas
Right.
For the future, and one is to create a virtual and physical Ulster Scots trail, one on the internet and one on the ground, where people could come as tourists or as pilgrimage or whatever you want to call it, and actually see these historic sites on the ground and learn about them on the computer as they travel around the country. And hopefully we can extend that from Maine into the other states and up into Canada as well over time. We're very active in finding a physical space for our archives, which are extensive, and an office and library arrangement so that we can share more easily with the public and have a central location for all of our records. We want to network with other communities, including the Native American community that you just discussed, the international community, and other local organizations, and provide access to data for the general public. We have the trilogy of books that are in progress of coming out, and volume 2 of the Ulster Scots is going to be of particular interest to those doing research, because we're often asked, for example, where's the passenger list for the Robert? Where's the passenger list for the McCallum or one of these other ships that came? And of course, there isn't any. But because of our extensive research and our volunteer efforts, we've created spreadsheets that are connecting. When we do find a ship and put it in the spreadsheet, and we do find a family that came on one of the ships, we put it in the spreadsheet. And now we can actually create partial passenger lists for many of these ships. They're not complete, they may never be complete, but at least there's a place to start where you can connect which ship, which family, which date, where did the ship come from, where did it go to, where did the family settle, the first generation, even possibly the second generation. So there's going to be a long, long list in that book, and probably the most important part of the book, at least from my perspective, is we're going to have a section just for bibliography information, so that no matter what aspect of the Ulster Scots trail that you're interested in, we will have sources for you to go look at, source information through the bibliography, and you can do your own research knowing where to find it, which I think is going to be very important. I see David Mitchell has entered the waiting room, and I want to thank Dave when he gets, so he can hear me, for donating to our group in 2018 the wall size map of the Mitchell map of 1755 and the atlas that went with it. Just tremendously helpful information, Dave. It's now part of our 10,000+ map references that we have computerized in our system.
Is that map in one of these books? I know I have your books, but I don't have them. I'm not at home at the moment.
No, you if you want that information, you'll have to contact us and tell us what you're looking for, and we will run the screening and get you the map information.
Thank you. Yeah,
Because some of those maps are not public knowledge and public access, and we need to have control over who gets to look at what. But if you send us what you're looking for, we can run it through and tell you, yes, that map is available, here's where you can get it, or we have one and we'll send you a PDF of it. While we're waiting, I want to thank the Ulster Scots Agency for all their support over the years. They've helped us with publishing, and they've helped us with many of our programs. And as a symbol of the lasting friendship and renewed connection between Maine and the Ulster area in the north of Ireland, they built for us from scratch a lambeg drum. And it is a thing of beauty and a great joy, and we will be sharing it at different programs that we go to throughout the state of Maine over the years. And I want to give a big shout out to the Ulster Agency and others who have helped us put that together. And it's now in Brad McFadden's home, and hopefully we'll have a home for it, permanent home for it in our new center when we get it set up.
well, John, this has been absolutely wonderful and enlightening and fascinating. And we certainly want to engage in a continued collaboration with you, and would love to have you back to speak again on other nuances of what you're doing. If anybody that needs John's contact information, you can reach out to us. Or John, do you want to just give everyone your email address?
Yes, I can do that. It's simply john@mannassociates.net.
john@mannassociates.net. Great, MANN. And I just want, I've not done this before, I feel so moved by this, but I just want to repeat something that I heard John say. And John, I may be asking you if I can quote you on this or even quote you in writing, but he said, when you hear the pipes for the first time on a site of a Scottish family that had been burned out, it's one of those moments when you know you're a Scot. And I just find that such a profound point. And the other thing John said was stories have to be told or they die. So I just encourage everyone to continue to tell your stories. Sorry to start crying on you all. I'm actually very happy today. So John, outstanding. Everyone, we hope you'll join every month. We have great, and we want you to be part of our family. So we'll look forward to seeing you on next month, second Saturday at 11 o'clock Eastern Time, 10 o'clock Central. And until then, be well and thank you. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Connie.
Thank you.
Thank both of you.
Thank you.
Dave.